Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming to my talk. The talk is Emergent Storytelling in New Media. Just a real quick primer. If you have any questions or if you have any comments or anything that you want to say during the talk, feel free to raise your hand. This is going to be pretty laid back, so feel free to interject or ask any questions that you have if they come up. About me, I am Ben Lane. I'm a game developer, programmer, and English nerd. I actually have a degree in English, got into programming in college, and have been doing freelancing for about the past 5 years or so. I've worked with a kind of wide array of companies. I've done interactive experiences for Intel and Coach and HP. And I've also worked on games. So I have kind of a weird, wide-ranging background. I actually got a job offer from Facebook, which I turned down. So if you need bad career advice, see me after the talk. I have a few goals that I've outlined for the talk here. The first is just to discuss interesting mediums where novel work is happening. The second is to learn from examples of successful emergent stories, and we'll get into what emergent stories actually are in a second. And the third is just to kind of hopefully pique your interest in some new types of storytelling. Hopefully you're going to hear about something that a type of storytelling that you've never heard before, a type of storytelling that you've never experienced, and it sparks your imagination for things, or just gets you interested, and maybe you want to seek out one of these projects. So, what is new media? So the first thing that pops up if you type it into Google is this first definition, which is typically any media that relies on computers or the internet for redistribution, which I think is a reasonable definition. But for the purposes of this talk, we're going to primarily be talking about new media that involves input from a user or a viewer or a player. And for most of this talk, I'll probably use the term user just because that's a term we use in programming frequently. Viewer, player, they're kind of all interchangeable, at least for the purposes of this talk. So, a little history. This is going to be kind of a timeline of some things, and then I'm going to ask you at the end what the kind of running theme is through all of these. The first known war game, Hellwig's War Game, was introduced in the 1780s. This is essentially just a piece of paper with some pieces that you put out and you simulate battle strategies and this sort of thing. The first known game book was published in 1930. If you've ever read a choose your own adventure book where you have multiple diverging narratives that have different conclusions, that is a game book. The infamous War of the Worlds CBS radio broadcast was 1938. So CBS put on a radio play of the novel War of the Worlds, and supposedly a lot of people panicked and thought it was real and thought aliens were actually invading our planet. The first interactive TV show, Winky Dink and You, was 1953. You could go to the store and buy a sheet that you could overlay on the television and draw on it, and Winky Dink would, cross a bridge that you drew or whatever. And I find some of these interesting because they're a lot earlier than you might have thought. 1953 interactive television, you don't really think that it would have been that early, but yeah. And then the first video game home console was the Magnavox Odyssey in 1972. The first multi-user chat room was Talk-O-Matic in 1973. The first Dungeons & Dragons introduction was in 1974, the tabletop role-playing game. And then kind of the big one for this talk, ARPANET evolves into the internet in 1974. All of our new media-related stuff comes out of the evolution of the internet. And then we have just a string of additional kind of interactive fiction stuff. The first digital story was Colossal Cave Adventure in 76. The first Choose Your Own Adventure was 79. The first social networking site was actually 96. It was a Swedish site called Lunar Storm, which I doubt anyone has ever heard of. I certainly hadn't before I started researching this. The first alternate reality game was 2001. And alternate reality games are pretty interesting. They typically start as though that they're a real experience, and the people involved in them don't know that it's fictionalized until they're kind of let in on some of the details later on. YouTube is 2005. Justin TV becomes Twitch TV, the kind of evolution of streaming content in 2011. The Oculus VR headset, which really popularized modern VR, was 2012. And the first novel written completely by an AI, based on Jack Kerouac's writings, was in 2018. So do any of you have any thoughts on what these all kind of have in common, specifically for the audience?
Not just passively consuming there, but they have some ability to participate.
Yeah, exactly. So the biggest thing about most of these is that they're really bringing agency into the home, into the broader public. So traditional media, traditional storytelling has predominantly been you receive the entertainment from some author or some director or whatever, whereas most of these are really allowing the audience or the viewer or the user to get involved in that process and help create those stories. And so that's kind of the first look at emergent storytelling. The amount of agency plays a big role in where we go. We've got movies on the left here with a guy looking super bored, like who cares, man? Movies, you just watch them, like that's no fun. And we've got SpongeBob looking super joyous and energetic on the right because he knows that your imagination can unlock all sorts of doors. And so we've got, books. Books are kind of in a similar camp to movies, traditional media. You have an author, they provide you with a story. Your mind can kind of wander while you read a book, but for the most part, you don't have a lot of agency in terms of how the story evolves. And on the other end, we have video games. And there's obviously a spectrum, but video games tend to lean farther on that right side of the agency spectrum, the agency gap here, where you provide input, you provide the means to create whatever happens in the game world. And then we have something like sports. Sports are kind of interesting because if you're a player of the sport, it's pretty straightforward. You have a set of rules. There isn't necessarily a lot of storytelling that comes out of that. But if you're a spectator, if you go to a Pickles game down at the Pickle Stadium, there's more going on there. You have an entertainer. You have a guy in a pickle costume throwing hot dogs at you or whatever. And stories emerge out of that. You spend time with your friends there. You have memories that are created and events that are created from that experience that go beyond, that emerge out of just what's happening on the field, just the actual game itself. But it's not just about agency. Typically, for emergent storytelling to occur, you need some sort of complexity as well. So I have a beautiful graph here that I did in all of 5 minutes. And you can kind of see the spectrum of agency and complexity, the axes here. We have, say, Cat in the Hat. There's not a lot you can get out of Cat in the Hat. You could do some sort of PhD dissertation on Cat in the Hat, but I don't think anybody's going to read it. I don't think anybody's going to find it particularly interesting. So that's kind of in the lower left quadrant here. But something like James Joyce's Ulysses, a book that is expansive and has all sorts of deep motifs and themes and characters, that's going to ramp up in complexity quite a bit. But it is still ultimately, you don't have a lot of agency there. It's still ultimately James Joyce's work. You can imagine different scenarios. You can come up with analyses of what's going on, but ultimately you're kind of left with whatever is on the page. You can't really branch out outside of that much. AI Dungeon, if any of you have ever tried it, is a mobile app where you input text and an AI generates a story for you. That tends to have quite a lot of agency. You have the entirety of the English language to put out anything that you can think of into this AI. But the actual complexity of what's happening there is pretty obscured from you. Somebody wrote that AI. You don't really have control over how that AI interprets what you put in. It can fluctuate based on how many words you're putting in and how detailed you are. But ultimately, somebody else has kind of decided how that works, and you don't have a lot of options on how to interact with it. You can only input text. And lastly, Dungeons and Dragons, and we're still in old media here, but Dungeons and Dragons kind of reaches the peak in that upper right quadrant here. So if you're unfamiliar with Dungeons and Dragons, there is a game master that kind of acts as the director for the story of whatever is happening in this game. And then there are the players who interact with that dungeon master and make specific choices and have a wide variety of tools to determine whether they're successful or they fail at certain actions that they try to do. They have skills like agility and strength that determine how likely they are to be successful at those various things. So there's a lot of mechanics, there's a lot of systematic complexity that happens in Dungeons and Dragons that go beyond just, oh, I'm putting in text, or oh, I'm saying what I'm doing right now. There is a branching pathway that happens that's gated by certain mechanics. So again, in my opinion, strong emergent narratives require both some amount of agency and systematic complexity to really find that sweet spot. So what? So why do we care? Why do we care about emergent narratives at all? More agency plus complexity equals what? Well, anecdotally speaking, I find that users are generally more engaged. If you are making an interactive story and it's really bad, I found that people are more likely to stick with it, at least for a little bit, than they are if you write a really bad story. If you write a really bad story and somebody picks it up and they know it's really bad, they'll probably be nice to you. They'll probably say like, oh, that was neat. But they'll probably, pitch it as soon as you're out of the room. An interactive experience gives you a little bit more initial credit for whatever reason. Maybe it's just we have agency and so we like to see it, and there's a psychological effect there. But it's easier for experiences to contain multitudes, and this is kind of a Walt Whitman-esque musing, but essentially what I'm saying here is that the experience that you are having in these interactive mediums can have more varied types of feeling, of emotion, of thematic element. And it creates a broader branching experience that really leads to creative and fun experiences. Things that you can't get really in any other type of narrative. And in the same vein, it creates completely new experiences. So one of the things we'll talk about later, because of the new media format, because of the ability to reach hundreds or thousands of people, you can do things that you've never really been able to do before. You can have, space battles where there are thousands of people involved. So let us look at some examples now. The first I'm going to talk about is Bandersnatch. Has anybody seen or heard Bandersnatch before? So Bandersnatch is a branching narrative. It's an interactive movie that's available on Netflix. And essentially what happens is you start on a linear pathway. You start with a character that has certain problems, and pretty early on in the experience you're given two choices. I think the first one is cereal. You can choose which cereal he has for breakfast. And this lets you in on the fact that this is going to be a branching experience. You click on one of the options and he grabs the Cocoa Puffs instead of the Rice Krispies or whatever. And it's interesting in that you have a lot of different options, a lot of different conclusions, But it is still ultimately mostly linear. So there are, 9 or so different conclusions that can be found by going through the different choices you have. And pretty much every choice that you end up making in the movie are one of two. So there's a left choice and a right choice, and you can kind of see that in the imagery here. This is a reoccurring thing in all of Black Mirror's content, but they have these branching pathways. So your agency is highly restricted. You have two options. You can't really go outside of that. You can't really, pick a secret third option or something. And so, in that same vein, you are the authors of Bandersnatch are limiting the systematic complexity that you're afforded. You point and click at your two options, and that's it. And the result of that is that there is a lot of illusion of choice. It seems like you have a lot of options, but ultimately you're pretty focused in on these narrow pathways that lead you to the conclusions that the authors wanted to show you. And that's great for what they were trying to do, but it's pretty limited in terms of the emergence that comes out of it. So, like the baseball game, you might have a experience with your friends, and that experience is a memorable story that you can relate to your family, or a funny story or whatever later on. But it's limited to that moment. There isn't a lot of new experiences that can come out of that. It's very much in the same vein as the old Choose Your Own Adventure books, The Cave of Time. It's coming out of that that history of being a divergent narrative, but ultimately authored. Spec Ops the Line is a video game that probably none of you have played. Has anybody heard of or played this? It was a pretty mediocre shooter series. Spec Ops was. It started in the early 90s. Call of Duty is kind of the big one that most people know, and that became way more famous and way more popular. But Spec Ops the Line was an interesting addition to the series because the developer Jaeger, a German studio, basically had free reign to do whatever they wanted with the title. The publisher came in and said, you have creative control. And so they made a story that is very loosely based on Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. You play as a character that is experiencing PTSD, and they're moving through this world and dealing with the consequences of the traumas of war. It is almost completely linear, and there's a little caveat there that I'll get to. But you do have substantially more agency and complexity than in something like Bandersnatch. So a first-person shooter is a game where you are the camera, you are viewing into the world, you have a gun, and you can point and shoot at things. But just that alone really enables a lot more agency. You choose where to look, you choose where to fire, you choose where to throw a grenade, or yell to a fellow soldier or whatever, or call out into the room or whatever. And so you have more agency and more complexity. You're in a 3D world, and this leads to choices that might seem that aren't presented to you in a way that you would normally be given a choice. You don't have the A/B option in the movie. Sometimes those choices are invisible. I have a clip here from a show called Extra Credits that goes into this a little bit. That goes into this a little bit more.
What I really want to talk
design. If you remember the moment where you were supposed to choose between
about is the actual design. If you remember the moment where you were supposed to choose between whether to kill a civilian who stole water, or a soldier who killed the civilian's family trying to apprehend him, you're actually allowed a series of other choices that are never made explicit. When I was playing, I actually shot the snipers, and one of my Delta Force buddies shot out the ropes. Too slow to stop the rest of the snipers shooting both prisoners, but still, the game recognized that as an alternative choice. The same thing occurs again when you're asked by your squad mate to give the order to fire on a crowd of civilians. Instead of doing so, I fired into the air, and to my delight, the crowd actually dispersed. This ability to actually make choices through the mechanics rather than simply through a menu is something more games need to integrate. But
as I was saying, you have options that, if you think of them, they are afforded to you. And the developers actually thought of them ahead of time as well, and put them into the game. If you fire above the crowd, they'll disperse in a different way than if you shoot into the crowd. They react differently if you actually target them. And so we have this instance of the mechanics that the programmers built supporting the narrative that they're trying to tell. This is supposed to be a pretty horrific game. It's supposed to be a game about somebody that's not only experiencing a lot of trauma, but contributing to that trauma, traumatizing other people. And the mechanical choices that the programmers have and designers have made reinforces that. They allow you to do things that are less traumatic, that give you some freedom, but ultimately they lead back to the same place, and they end up giving you the final conclusion of the story that is pretty traumatic. But I think that this valid invisible choice option is really interesting and something that is pretty new. You can't really get this in old forms of media. It's only in media where you have a lot of agency that you can allow the user to discover things on their own. PB here is another really interesting one. This was actually made on TikTok, and I'll play the first clip here. This is the first thing that anybody saw when they began this experience.
Hello, this is day whatever of me being trapped in the swim. I don't know what I'm doing here, don't know why I'm here. This is what my room looks like if you're interested. Anyways, I've been here for a while and I'm not quite sure what I'm doing, so I don't know. Can you leave a comment or something? Maybe I can read it. See what's up? Thank you. Yeah, how do I turn it up?
So, you open your TikTok app, you're scrolling through, and randomly you see this weird, claymation-esque guy asking you to help him get out of a room, which is very much not what the normal experience on TikTok is like. It's a pretty weird and interesting new experience that most of the people that probably stumbled upon this were, going to have. It is a loosely authored story. There's a person behind this. There's a person doing all the animation and the modeling for this character and the world that is, in these videos. But it is invisibly nonlinear. So really what we have here is an alternate reality game. This one, obviously, from the start is fictional, but people are encouraged to get involved right away. He's asking them to comment in the app and give this character direction. And that's exactly what happened. People immediately started giving him suggestions about how to get out of the room. People were saying things like, grab the chair that's in there and slam it on the door. And the person behind this would actually do that. He would animate the character and model the character taking the chair and smashing it on the door, and it didn't work. And so people had to come back with new suggestions. They had to come up with new ideas of what to do here. And so even though the experience that they ultimately have is completely linear, there's a series of videos that reach a final conclusion. It's like a TV show or some sort of installment-based series. There is actually a lot of choice here. There are clearly points in the story that could have diverged in multiple different ways, but ultimately the choices that everybody communally made resulted in a final ending based on those choices. And this was just kind of a really interesting one because it was so random and weird and on a new platform that is not used for this sort of content really at all. But it's a great example of what happens when you give players a ton of choice, give them an environment and a room and allow them to say whatever they want, but you also constrain that choice as the author. You limit what they're able to do inside that room. So, there's a bed and a camera and a door and a chair, and they are given these tools to kind of figure out what to do, but they don't really have anything beyond that. If you've ever been to an escape room, this is kind of a similar thing that is really popularized now, that you are given a set of tools, and those tools inform what you're allowed to do. And this also still requires creative direction from an author. So if you are interested in telling a story, a specific type of story, but you want to get people involved, this is a great way to do it. You can have people come up with new ideas. You can springboard off those ideas and create new experiences based on them. But ultimately, you're still in control of the story that you're trying to tell. You can guide them to a specific ending. You can guide them to a specific metaphor that you want to convey, and that sort of thing.
Hello, this is Dave.
And the last game example I have here is NoPixel, which I don't know if anybody has heard of this, but NoPixel is a role-play game based on Grand Theft Auto. So Grand Theft Auto is a third-person game where you play as a character that can walk around the city and do various crime-related activities. But NoPixel took that base game and modded it so that extraordinarily heavily, so that you can play that character as though you are that character. They set up specific servers that allow you to take on the role of a character that you create, and then you, as the player, go in and you pretend to be that character all the time while you're in the city. Their process for this is actually pretty extensive. They have an application process. You have to go onto their website and you have to apply. You have to write a short story that kind of gives them some sense of how creative you are, how good you are at coming up with things on the spot. And then once you're in the store, or once you're in the server playing with other people, there's a set of rules that you have to abide by. So there are certain, there are certain structures that say, oh, if somebody, points a gun at you, you have to immediately put your hands up. You can't, try and fight them, because they're trying to make this as much of a parallel to the real world as possible. If somebody approaches you with a gun on the street, you're probably not going to immediately try to start boxing them. And so that informs the stories that are able to be told in this environment. If they didn't have this structure, it kind of descends into the multiplayer that already exists on the actual Grand Theft Auto original game, which is just basically chaos. There's people driving all over the streets and running people over and shooting rocket launchers and crashing jets and stealing boats and all sorts of crazy stuff. And there's emergent fun that kind of comes out of that, but there aren't a lot of emergent stories. And NoPixel has kind of taken that in the other direction by constraining it, by boxing it in, and by finding creative people that can kind of help facilitate the creation of these narratives. So really at this point we're nearing the maximal levels of complexity and agency that can be afforded to us. The tools that they've added, the programmers of NoPixel have added, are kind of mind-blowing. And I'll play this clip here that'll kind of give you a brief sense of it. But it's...
Welcome to the long-awaited NoPixel 3.0, a completely reimagined way to experience Grand Theft Auto as both a player and a viewer. This video will give you a glimpse into the world of NoPixel roleplay. NoPixel hosts a myriad of characters, from satire to immersive storytellers. And with the 3.0 update, the developers have completely overhauled the mechanics to facilitate roleplay in the ever-evolving online environment.
So that last thing that you saw there was a person with a WWE championship belt jumping off of a building onto an ambulance, which is obviously ridiculous, but the cool thing about that sort of content is that what probably happened afterwards is that a medic came out, revived him or brought him into the hospital, and then he had to stay in the hospital until he was treated by a doctor, and then he had to pay that doctor some amount of money because he received a service, and then he'd be released into the public so he could go jump off another building or whatever. And if you saw the police in there driving cop cars around. They actually have a police force in the game. There is a system of law and a police force that enforces those laws. If you break the law, they will come and arrest you. You can actually report it. You have access to a phone in the game. You can call 911, which will send your location to the police officers, and they'll show up. And they have a precinct, and there's just a huge array of tools that they've been given to help facilitate the storytelling here. And so really the only constraints that end up happening are the limitations of the software, the rules of the server, and the creativity of the players. In the same way that Dungeons and Dragons has been really successful for however many years now, 60 years or whatever, new media has enabled us to do this in a new setting. We can have 50 or 100 or 500 people online in this city interacting in completely emergent ways, where people will create their own stories. They'll have businesses, they'll run those businesses that have illicit drug rings, and then they'll get busted by the cops. And it turns into these huge branching, exploding narratives that have that people are really invested in. Most of the people that play NoPixel also stream on Twitch. And so they'll have an audience, they'll have their chat interacting, they'll have their chat that is watching them in this world give suggestions, and maybe they'll listen to those suggestions, and things will unfold in that way. So it's a very collaborative experience. One of the downsides, though, is that an experience like this is kind of is limited by the creativity of the users. So NoPixel has kind of gotten around this by having their application process. But other games have tried something similar, and if you are not a particularly good storyteller or improviser, sometimes it can fall into these ruts where people will, people will try and improvise, but it'll fall flat, or it won't feel very engaging. And so there are ways to combat that, but it is one of the downsides of this sort of storytelling. So we've looked at a few different types of branches so far in terms of linear versus emergent nonlinear storytelling. The top here is kind of the choose your own adventure style path, where you have a starting point and decisions branch out further and further until you have a network here, but that is ultimately still pretty linear. The biggest pro of this version is that it's relatively simple to implement. Like Bandersnatch, you have two choices. Those two choices can expand out to other choices. The biggest con is that there's a very good chance that most of the people that engage with this content aren't going to see all of it. They might go down one path, they might get the bad ending, and then they're done. They're done with your experience. And so you made a lot of content that nobody will ever see, or at least a large majority of the players will never see. But this is kind of the old-fashioned way of doing things. This is what Zork and Choose Your Own Adventure and all these other types of stories did. Something that's probably more popular now is a branch and bottleneck. And this is truly what Bandersnatch did, where it's still branching, there's still a tree, but you go out into multiple different paths, and then you converge back onto the same path. So this allows you to constrain the number of endings, it allows you to constrain the number of paths that are available to people, while still seeming very, very diverse, very emergent. But it reduces the complexity that is needed, and it encourages players to replay the few select paths rather than the 20 or 30 or 40 or whatever that can happen from this first branching tree. And then the last one that I have here is the string of pearls, which is more like Spec Ops, in that there are these little nuggets of gameplay, these little moments that are very interesting and emergent and allow you multiple different options. But ultimately the path is linear, and you end up at the same conclusion each time. And this is great because it really reduces the amount of complexity. It's definitely the easiest probably of these to do, to create, but it still affords, these little weird areas for people to explore. And those can be really fun and engaging in and of themselves. So those little moments are oftentimes as memorable or even more memorable than the final product because you felt involved in the experience. You helped facilitate that little branching path, and you felt like you had some agency over what happens. And then the best type, subject to my personal opinion, are these kind of crazy, mechanically driven, branching narratives that occur in something like NoPixel, where you are given a play box, you're given a sandbox, an area to explore the different mechanics, and then you're kind of just let loose. I think the best ones constrain you in some significant way. NoPixel, again, gives you a set of rules to follow. But ultimately, the stories that come out of that are totally your own and totally subject to the creativity of the other users around you. And, like stories that happen in real life, they're all based on what happens. They're all based on the emergence of social interaction, based on, pre-planning and the idea that you can decide your own fate. And you'll see this not just in NoPixel and D&D, but in most MMOs. Minecraft is another great example. Part of the reason that Minecraft has been so popular, especially with young people, I think, is because it gives you so much agency over the creative direction of whatever it is you're building. And so I have some other cool, just famous examples, famous in, certain communities, I guess, but some other examples that you might have seen at Forbes or something at one point. The first one is the Massacre at M2-XFE in the game EVE Online. This is the game that I mentioned earlier where you have these massive space battles. And the cool thing about this one is that it's just the game. Like, this is just stuff that happens fairly regularly in the game. This specific event was the largest multi-user battle, multi-user experience that I know of in entertainment. About 7,000 people were involved in the experience. The way that EVE Online works is you can purchase ships with real money, and so, you can purchase game time that allows you to get new ships or whatever, but essentially, in this one battle alone, there were about $1.5 million worth of ships deployed. And after the battle concluded, about $378,000 worth of those ships were destroyed. Which it seems really interesting that people can invest so much time into an experience and be willing to lose that much, but that is a huge part of the storytelling. There's real investment here. And so this is just a cool time lapse I found of the battle online. And if you can see, it's a little probably hard to see, but each kind of little speck up there is an individual player. And all the flashing lights and all the stuff shooting out are people firing at each other in these spaceships. And you'll see people leaving as well, those kind of shooting stars off into the distance, or people warp driving out of the battle. But it's just this really kind of, it's almost beautiful in its just cosmic weirdness. And it's cool just to see 6,800 people-ish, all involved in the same pursuit of blowing each other to smithereens. Another really famous example, and this one is actually kind of famous, this made its way into like the New York Times and a bunch of other places, is the corrupted blood incident from World of Warcraft. So back in September of 2005, a dungeon, which is like this opportunity for a group of like 4 or 8 people to go in together and fight a monster to get some cool new item. This dungeon called Zul Garub was introduced, and this monster had an interesting attack in that they could inflict a player with a status called Corrupted Blood, and this Corrupted Blood status would slowly drain your health until the boss of this dungeon, this snake-like guy on the screen, was defeated. What the developers forgot was that they could teleport out during this instance. So they could leave the arena and still have that infliction attached to their character. And there were a few other, related factors, one of which was that you can have pets in this game, and the pets could be inflicted with corrupted blood. But there was a way to turn off the damage for your pet, so that pet could just be walking around with this affliction that could spread to other people. But that pet itself wouldn't die, so it could keep coming back. And basically, what ended up happening was most of the game got infected. This is kind of, we're still in COVID time, so this is maybe extra applicable, but it was an actual pandemic that was created out of the mechanics of this game. And so, people would log into the game and they would immediately die. People would, stand outside of cities and act as town criers saying, hey, we've got a really bad infection here, don't come into this city. People would intentionally infect themselves and then go running into a city so that they could infect as many people as possible. There's just a lot of really interesting social mechanics that went into this just because it was a bug and the developers forgot to turn off, the damage. There's actually a few other instances of this happening. There was a Star Wars game that actually did this intentionally later on because of this event. And there's another one from a game called RuneScape where players accidentally were allowed to kill each other, and that obviously had a massive impact. So there's a few honorary mentions for that one. This is probably my favorite example that comes exclusively from the mechanics of a game. It's the Dwarf Fortress Drunk Cats incident. So this game has been in development for like 25 years or something insane. And basically the developer of the game wanted to add taverns to the game. He wanted to add a place where the dwarfs could go to drink. And he noticed after a while that for some reason all the cats kept vomiting all over the tavern. And he didn't know why, so he began to look into it. And one of the things he did early on was, you're at a tavern, people get drunk and rowdy. Well, he decided he would make the drinks in the tavern spillable. He'd make beer slosh on the floor. And 8 years prior to that, he had added the ability for people and animals to track blood on their footprints. They would walk through a pool of blood, and that would track through. Well, he decided that should be all fluids, right? It's not just blood. It could be anything. It could be water. It could be beer. And cats can track fluids, Cats can step in beer and track it all over the place, right? Well, cats can also clean themselves. And the developer decided on a whim that, cats clean themselves by licking themselves. So if they're licking themselves, they must be ingesting whatever they've tracked in on their feet. So obviously what happened was cats wander into a tavern, track beer on their feet, later clean themselves, ingest the alcohol, become drunk, and begin vomiting all over the tavern. It's a really phenomenal example of just how much complexity can go into new media. Like you can't get an experience like this out of traditional storytelling, right? Like somebody can describe this event, and it's funny, but it's not nearly as funny as just like this happening to you and you discovering what was causing this. And then another famous example of recent years is Fortnite. And Fortnite, gets a little bit of a bad rap because it's a lot of the people that play it are very young, and there's a lot of kind of silliness to it. But this is a fun example of what happens when you try to make emergent moments that just come out of the blue, and you can really have these magical experiences. So I'm going to play a little bit of normal gameplay, what you would typically experience. And then I'm going to play one of the authored live events that Epic Games put into the game. Lots of running around, lots of swinging and collecting resources. Pretty low key. Like there's not really anything, happening there that anybody would be interested in except for the person playing. Yeah.
I play the game, and that's just the basics of it.
Yeah.
If you get later on to it, it's a lot of reasons why a lot of people leave the game. Because later on it gets more harder and...
Yeah, definitely. The game, as it goes on, when you get into these firefights, it definitely picks up in intensity, and it gets a lot harder.
Also, this isn't even the original mode. This is the Battle Royale mode. This is the original, which is Save the World.
Yes, yeah. The original version of the game actually was a completely different experience. The Battle Royale mode that came afterwards was the multiplayer mode that was actually taken from a different game and kind of pasted on top. But that's the one that blew up and made this game really popular.
This is very, very outdated gameplay.
Yes, this is old gameplay. Yeah, and the experience that was happening there is pretty banal. You're running around, you're walking with a gun, you're whatever, grabbing resources. But what the live events do is they take that experience and they just kind of explode it. You can be in the experience, do things, and something like this might happen to you. So obviously that's a little different from the normal way that you're experiencing the game. And you might actually have,
That is called the 0 point, which is basically the whole thing of the island. If that thing gets destroyed, everything turns
collapsed in on itself. Yeah. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think after that point, while they were updating the game, if you logged in, you'd be in like a black hole
in a black hole
for like 12 hours or something.
There's a lot of lore behind it. Those 7 rocks that just fell down, those are very important characters to the lore of the game. And the storyline's still going on to this day.
Yep, exactly. So this is a really cool example of how like a weird random moment can just be inserted into an experience that feels really magical. It's very memorable. I had played the game back when they did the first one of these events, and it was a really special experience because you just didn't see it coming. Like there was no indication. I mean, there was some indication, but you didn't expect it to affect everybody in the space. You could have just been playing the game normally, and then it happened, and then it disrupted the entirety of the gameplay. And so it was this really unique experience that comes out of just being willing to mess with the end user of your narrative, being able to subvert what you're used to doing and doing something completely different, and having a cool magical moment. I also have a wide variety of honorary mentions here that didn't make it into the talk. There is an ongoing 40-year D&D campaign. A history professor out of Ontario has a setup in his basement, and he has just been running a continuous D&D campaign for 40 years. And it's another great example of just how emergent narratives can really blossom and continue perpetuating themselves, because again, the limit is the mechanics and the creativity of what you have in front of you. Speedrunning is a whole cool thing. Real-time strategy games are kind of the modern equivalent of the old war games that I mentioned at the very start of the talk. They allow you to explore different battle scenarios and come up with your own strategies on the fly. There's a very cool set of websites, one of which is Hack This Site, which kind of pretend, they put you in the position of being a hacker. And the whole premise of the site is that you can actually are permitted to hack it, to go in and mess with the code and play around with it. And this it's just kind of a fun experience as you discover little Easter eggs and little secrets that they've put in there, knowing that you're going to mess with what you supposedly shouldn't be messing with. There's a number of games that have really cool background. A shout out to tilting a pinball machine. That's kind of a classic emergent experience. Streaming and social media are huge areas to talk about. I didn't put them in because they are so expansive that you could kind of talk about those for hours on their own. Streaming specifically is an interesting area. We talked about it a little bit with NoPixel, but streaming affords you the opportunity to put yourself out there or put some version of yourself out there and interact with an audience. Sometimes stories emerge out of that. Oftentimes little moments, kind of like going to a baseball game and being with your friends, little moments and nuggets happen, and people take those moments and they turn them into, further experiences. They draw art, or they make videos about them, or they animate, things about them online. And social media is just kind of a whole thing on its own. Streaming and YouTube and those sorts of things are a form of social media. But obviously people create threads on Twitter, and they make posts on Facebook that evolve and end up on CNN or whatever. And so those are a form of emergent stories. They're just kind of ones that we have less control over. They emerge more naturalistically just based on, our emotions and how people engage online. So really quickly, just a quick review of some of the stuff we've talked about. Agency is increased via choices. The more choices a player has or a user has, the more branches generally are going to result from that. And so to combat that, we need to limit the options that they have. Branches increase complexity, difficulty between choices, and difficulty understanding the ramifications of what those choices will do also increase complexity. So we really need to hone that in. We need some way to constrain the user of a story. NoPixel does this by having a set of server rules and having an application process. Dungeons and Dragons does this by having a game book, a rule book that generally gives you a set of rules to follow. You can break those if you want. Freeform emergent narratives still often have some authorial direction. PB here, has the author in the background directing the story. NoPixel has the server admins enforcing the rules. So paradoxical as it may seem, reducing the number of choices that somebody has when they're engaging with your story can often improve the quality of the story. When you have something like AI Dungeon, where you just have too many options, things go off in crazy directions and they kind of devolve into chaos and nothingness. So provide the end users of whatever story you're crafting with tools. Make sure those tools are kind of tuned in, and the mechanics of whatever those tools are, whether it's language, whether it's a game mechanic, make sure that those support the narrative that you're trying to tell. Like Fortnite, collective experiences with one-off events that subvert the typical narration of your story can lead to really magical moments. And then keep in mind the social element. We're all social creatures. Streaming and social media have really facilitated the ways in which we interact with stories. We find stories, we share stories, we create spin-offs of those stories. So consider how you want that to inform the sort of storytelling that you do, or the sort of storytelling that you just engage in and you read. Do you want to go down the rabbit hole and find some long Twitter thread about what Fortnite theories are going to happen next season? That's all open to you. And that is, for the most part, it. August 16th, I am going to be doing some nonlinear storytelling using Unity and Yarn. We're going to maybe try and put into practice some of the things that we talked about today, but mostly we're just going to explore and try and have some fun and come up with our own stories. So feel free to come to that. I also have some references and further exploration that will be in the slides, which I believe will be available via the Discord or Slack. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take any questions or open the floor for discussion.
I'll give everybody else a chance before I ask you a million questions.
Sure.
Anybody else have any thoughts or questions for Ben? Okay, so thank you, Ben. That was awesome. I have so many, as you know, I'm also deeply invested in agency and have no tolerance for passive media. But there's a few things that I just want to push on a little bit, because I think there's one in particular is really interesting to me. It's you put books almost fully at the movie end of the spectrum, but I kind of think that imaginative agency elevates books above movies, where you have to do some work. You have to decide what characters look like, sound like, whatever. And one thing that has actually really changed my mind about this, and I'm sorry I can't remember even who pointed it out, but search for Spider-Man Atari.
Spider-Man Atari?
Imaginative agency was actually a requirement in early video games. So this is a game I played when I was a kid. So maybe just play that video. This is a game I played when I was a kid.
Hello, everyone.
You can stop. So this is what this game looks like. That's Spider-Man. You're climbing this building. I went back when I heard this comment a couple years ago, and I looked at this video game. And what's insane is if I hadn't looked at this, I played this game when I was a kid. If you had just asked me what this game looked like and asked me what the graphics were, I'd be like, well, they were pretty good. There was a brick building. It was a brick building. Yeah. Spider-Man was there. And the thing that I realized, and just is almost the thing that's lost in modern games, is there's a great deal of imaginative agency when you're a kid and this is the graphic fidelity that you have. Because in my memory, it was photoreal, basically. Or even it probably looked like a Nintendo game at worst or something. That was my version of Spider-Man when I was little.
Yes.
The Superman, if you search for Superman Atari, it's even less, actually, you maybe should search for Superman Atari, because it is to the point of I think it's just called Superman. So just search for Superman Atari. It is almost to the point, it's almost not even representative graphics anymore. It's almost to the point of
completely abstract.
But I guess what I realized in that and listening to this previous talk was actually I think there was a great deal of imaginative agency in this era, because I'm sure there's any number of people like me that hadn't looked at this since they were kids, and their mind fully remembered it as photoreal. And I think that's even something that happens now, for like you remember the games that you grew up with photographic. So I just wanted to put that in your mind and ask you what you thought of that, of this like the role of player imagination, because I think there's other examples of like if it's a mystery story and you're trying to figure out who done it or whatever, whether that's in a game or even in a book, how you feel like that falls into this realm of agency and storytelling.
Yeah, I mean, you're totally right. I was being a little hand-wavy with it at the start. The axes of like complexity and agency for basically everything that I listed at the start are, they're more nebulous than that. Yeah, that's totally true. I think books can give you a ton of imaginative interest. I know that like when I read, I find myself going off in a bunch of different directions and often thinking about stories that I want to tell, or inventing new narratives that maybe were based very loosely on what I've been reading or that sort of thing. And the same is true for games, the same is true for everything. Really, even some of the games that I talked about, the imaginative component is a huge part of that.
Dwarf Fortress in particular.
Dwarf Fortress is a phenomenal example. Dwarf Fortress is almost too open in that you can basically just do whatever you want from the start.
And the visual representation is just asking.
Yeah, I should even I should show you guys what...
The game that you're talking about that you had the cat vomit is just like ASCII characters on the screen, and it's still one of the most immersive kind of storytelling sandboxes. In fact, actually, what I was going to suggest is maybe when we're done with the talk that we watch that Dwarf Fortress interview, the no-clip interview a few steps up.
Yeah, this is Dwarf Fortress here. So this game that has amazing mechanics of cats getting drunk in taverns and vomiting everywhere looks like this. Predominantly because the person that makes it isn't an artist, he's just a programmer that was really interested in building this huge immersive world. And these were the tools that he had at the time that has just continued to evolve. But the art has stayed predominantly the same.
That's another thing I wanted to ask you about, because I think, some of the examples, I think you had good examples on both fronts of complex storytelling through like the efforts of human creativity to like tell a complex story, like a David Cage game or something like that, some game with branching possibilities that are authored by humans, versus something like Dwarf Fortress where there's no stories that are authored, there's just parameters and systems that do that, and kind of what your thoughts are on that spectrum of like, because one of them is a explicitly creative storytelling effort, and one of them is more of an explicitly like systems authoring effort. And I would even say things like Minecraft kind of fall into that realm. It's like sandbox kind of experiences where...
I was going to say that my generation really hard when it first came out. Like I played it since like the very beginning, and like even looking at the mod scene for Minecraft, like there's so many different like ways of just adding blocks to give people more materials to make new stories with.
100%, yeah.
That's true with Dwarf Fortress.
Yeah.
That like modding is a big part of it.
Yeah.
Some people don't play with the original graphics, even though.
Yeah.
Sure, that's a big point too.
And
Like,
modding too is, I was going to mention when we were talking about books, it's like fan fiction. Like these ways of making these rules, and like you're talking about having these constraints to be able to tell new stories. Fan fiction is huge because you have these characters that you kind of have to obey the world systems, whatever, and then you can spin them off in another direction. And so it kind of allows for that. Like you said, like your mind is wandering in these stories, and you're like, oh, I can just write that. I can just make whatever situation I want with these characters. I can make crazy crossovers. I can do all this stuff because there's rules enough that gets my computers to go do something else.
Yeah, and the traditional definition of emergent media is that it's stories that come out of the complexity from the mechanics of whatever the thing is that you're engaging with. I didn't focus on that too much specifically because, especially with new media, things get very hazy very quickly. There are all sorts of weird conjunctions where an author with an idea interacts with somebody, usually digitally, and it evolves from there. It turns into a new experience. It turns into new games even, modded Dwarf Fortress or modded Minecraft is so far from the original intention of Minecraft that it's not really even the same game anymore, even though that is the foundation of what it is.
And that's where it turns from a game, like you said, into that system.
Yes.
System that has the rules.
Yeah, but there's also authors on many of the servers on Minecraft Online. There are people that have an idea for a story that they want to tell, and they have rules on those servers that inform how people are supposed to play, and that is what informs the narrative. And so really, going back to your point, Scott, there's just a ton of overlap and a ton of mishmashing of both in most new media domains, where authors have ideas, players have ideas. Sometimes the author has more control, and like in PB here, right, the author has quite a lot of control. They've intentionally designed it so that they have a lot of control. They decide what works, what input the player gives them works, and what doesn't. If they find something interesting, they could spin it off in a new direction that they hadn't even thought of. But most likely they have outlines laid out that they're going to follow and allow the players to succeed based on those outlines. Whereas in something like modded Minecraft, there are almost no rules, and players are allowed to create whatever comes to them. The mechanics of the game are the only limitations, and the narratives that spin out of that can be, more or less organized depending on a variety of factors.
It's been interesting to see how many people, it's funny that we keep so talking about Minecraft because it was sort of one of the earliest and continues to be the most successful, not for lack of trying, of so many, every publisher was like, we need a survival game.
We need to make a
Minecraft to try.
Yeah.
And all we do is put a system and then they make it fun. And it's Sea of Thieves and it's whatever it is, it's please just come up with fun stories in our game so we don't have to. And how few of those have succeeded. Sea of Thieves did okay, but I think that was largely because of Game Pass making it free. But there's not, there's all the other DayZ, Rust, all of these others that have some of those survival elements that certainly have their communities, but nothing of the scale of Minecraft.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that no one has kind of nailed it in that way since then.
Yeah, Minecraft is an interesting example, I think, partly because it was so early in that context. There were a lot of games that had sort of building blocks, but too many of them were complex. Warcraft 3 was a real-time strategy game, a battle simulator type game that spawned whole genres now because they had a cool toolkit where players could make their own content. But there was a bit of a learning curve there. You still needed to kind of know a little bit of how computers worked or how programming worked to really produce something of any quality. Minecraft really simplified that down to the base level where you have blocks and you can do things with those blocks. And so the entry level was very low, but the complexity cap was very high. A really big example actually that I listed in the honorary mentions here is Minecraft Redstone. So Redstone is a material in Minecraft that allows you to build circuits in the game, like actual electrical engineering circuits. And people have done things like recreated 16-bit calculators inside of the game. Yeah, there's all sorts of crazy stuff that people have done. And people build model replica or two-scale replicas of the Starship Enterprise. People build giant castles into the sky. People program Pokemon or whatever. There's a huge differential between the entry-level Minecraft, which is punch a tree, and the end-level Minecraft, which is build a 16-bit computer. And I think that is a huge reason why it succeeded because it touched every type of audience. It allowed people to explore pretty much any creative avenue that they would want to. But it didn't constrain them too much. It didn't put them on a ship like Sea of Thieves and tell them that they had to do a specific task or whatever.
Another one that would be good for your examples of Minecraft specifically is, have you heard of the censorship library server? Yeah, it's a massive server that's a giant library that anybody can put books into, and it's a tool for places that have censorship for journalists to publish.
Oh, interesting.
So you can access it anywhere around the world, and it's kind of this third space online that doesn't have to deal with governmental censorship and stuff.
Well,
It's hosted in Minecraft.
The bummer of that is now Microsoft is enforcing even private server blacklisted, which is on the surface it's for superficially it is for moderation but even on private servers, that they can moderate what's going on private servers, and that's just like disconcerting in the long term for these like amazing open projects. Now suddenly it's like, wait, Microsoft is moderating my private server? It's a bummer. I mean, that's a big thing with Minecraft anyway, is like its legacy under Microsoft stewardship versus like, and it's this weird bifurcation where the Java edition still exists and survives because Microsoft hasn't quite killed it, but then they have their Bedrock edition, and that is actually the edition that's on every platform. It's weird. It seems to me
they're
like,
not cross-compatible at all.
yeah, not at all. And it seems to me like Microsoft is just like waiting for an excuse to kill the Java. They're just like,
Probably, that wouldn't surprise me.
Actually, Java and Bedrock can be compatible with specific servers if they enable it.
well, but like the Switch version can only, for example, if you only have a console version, I think they can only connect to Bedrock servers, right? Like
Unless they have one that can cross.
oh yeah, maybe there's ways to hack around it, but
I think then, Andy?
Yeah, I had like some questions on two extremes, but I was going to follow up on the sort of imagination aspect of books, because I think that's true. That maybe I grew up with, I've never had a TV till I grew up in India, so everything was in books, and it felt like there was so much more creative possibility there, because your imagination was active. It was interactive with them. But I wanted to ask about that it seems like there's so much potential to this new medium, that it seems the storylines that are mostly visible or popular or successful are those that involve sort of like some sort of gamification in terms of like winning or a quest or building like a task with a clear outcome or goal. And I'm wondering if you've seen or if people have tried like completely different, maybe that's just a natural human storyline. Those are what most books are about too, sort of tropes, but that whether they sound off just sort of lingering of just very like doing something completely useless, doing something.
I was going to mention that's on my list too. Is we didn't really talk about walking simulators, and it's there's like unfortunately that exists, but there's a negative connotation on it. They're called walking simulators as almost this sort of dismissive thing, but it's games that are narratives that unfold by moving through an environment that don't necessarily, you're not shooting people, you're not like uncovering mysteries of the universe by solving puzzles necessarily. So that's something I wanted to ask about, is like where do games like, Gone Home I feel like still is maybe the core example of that, but there's a whole lineage of What Remains of Edith Finch, and they all have names like that, right? Like Dear Esther and The Vanishing of Ethan Carter. They almost have all
long kind of.
Yeah, they always have the same.
Maybe a little pretentious names.
Artful, pretentious names, but I'm really interested in that. Is like the pure storytelling, because Nandini's kind of right. Is like especially what bubbles up popularly, maybe with almost just the exception of Gone Home. It's almost the one that really broke out wide.
Yeah.
That there is. And it's hard to tell is it like, because audiences demand and expect it, or is it because publishers and developers are nervous to do purely narrative experiences? I guess the other, of course, is the entire realm of visual novels, which many people would not even consider games also. So where do you think those things fall into the agency spectrum if you're not actually solving puzzles or fighting crime or killing bad guys or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, and actually on some of the games that I've put on the list that we're going to install here that you can try out if you want to. They have some of those more walking simulator type games. In terms of the walking simulators, I see, which is again kind of a useless description because they're not that.
Right.
They're definitely experiences inside of worlds that have some sort of narrative that they're trying to convey. But in terms of those, it depends. It depends a lot on what the ambiguity is, like what sort of, how nebulous is the story that's being told there. If it's very, very nebulous, I have a feeling that most people are probably not going to engage with it in a very popularized, broad sense, just because in the same way that most people don't engage with James Joyce's Ulysses because it's so complex and open-ended and difficult to understand. People like goals. It's just a psychological thing for people to like having the hero, having the hero's journey, having an overarching narrative where good meets evil or whatever. that tends to be popular. There are still going to be tons of niche audiences that really enjoy more nebulous, more abstract, more ambiguous experiences that have deeper metaphors. But whether or not they break out into the mainstream is a little hard to say. There have been some examples, like Scott mentioned, Gone Home, What Remains of Edith Finch were fairly popular. I think a kind of a good one that is not quite in the same vein, but kind of orbiting it, is Undertale, which is a game that takes everything that you expect in terms of like a hero's journey style story, and then subverts a lot of those tropes and gives you different areas to explore, some of which are very metaphorical and deal with friendship and loss and some very high art concepts.
Yeah, I guess you're right about the Undertale part, about like the thing you mentioned is that because there's like multiple paths to the story. There's been 3: the genocide, the neutral, and the pacifist.
Yeah.
And your actions obviously affect the story.
Yeah, and so usually when people talk about walking simulators, what they're talking about is a game that has lots of agency but no direction. And I think the direction is really still important for getting you to a strong emergent narrative. That direction can be from you as the user, or it can be from the author, or it can be from constrained mechanics. But if it's literally just moving from point A to point B in an environment where there's potentially some like text overlay or audio in the background or something, it becomes kind of amorphous and hard to latch onto. Yeah. Go ahead.
I'll jump in with another. I was ready for you, but I didn't know if you were just stretching or had a question.
Do you have a question, Chris?
Yes. I was thinking about Untitled Goose Game.
Yeah.
Where do you think that falls on the spectrum?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't played Untitled Goose Game. I'm familiar with it. That to me seems kind of more like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems more like the String of Pearls style tree, where you're going from point A to point B. The goose has to like steal some items or something, right? But there are these little moments of kind of unexpected joy that come out of it, where you have to like steal an item from a gardener, and that gardener gets mad because he can't find his item, and then he sees that a goose is stealing his watering can or whatever. It's just this funny, cute little emergent experience.
You have to do certain things to like distract him, and you have like, that's where the agency comes in.
Yeah.
Like, how are you gonna get him away from the thing you're trying to get?
And there might be 5 ways. Like if the goal is distract the gardener, maybe there's 4 ways to it. Yeah, it's very cute. It is a bit of a meme game where people like the idea of it more than I think they actually liked the game.
Yeah.
But it does have that, at least, there's a problem and here's a toolkit to solve it. Which actually leads to the question I have for you, is like, on the spectrum of like, all these ways you talked about, as a, people on the stream that want to tell these stories and make these things, like the ways to do it. Like, okay, you can just make a story and you can write all the branches. You can be David Cage and you can make this insanely complicated narrative web, and you have to write every story and you have to say, how does this person, I think Walking Dead's another example of this. Or one of the Telltale games, where you will do something and it'll say like, Clem's going to remember that. And then like 3 episodes later, some decision, offhanded thing you said here causes some terrible disaster later down. But those are like very human authored. And of course, like you mentioned, there's this invisible hand sometimes there's the bottleneck where actually in the end it doesn't matter because we have to get you here. But you don't know that. Like the invisible hand is coming. So there's that is the extreme like authorial intent of an individual director, individual team of writers. The other end of the spectrum is the Dwarf Fortress, where I'm not sure they've written a narrative. Like beyond, they build systems that build narratives and build systems that build backstories, but I don't know that they've just like written a story because that's not what they want. And so in the middle, as we're thinking about like, well, we're people and we want to tell stories. Like, I just am curious, sort of in your experience, and I'm sure everyone in the stream has examples of like, what are really some examples of what you think of as really exceptional use of, or expression of agency for users in some interactive experience? Like, can you point to any that are like, just what comes to mind as like the top tier, like the biggest successes you think of as like achieving these like 21st century storytelling goals?
In terms of like entirely user driven?
I think anywhere on the spectrum. I think in just in the realm of, my view of this is that 21st century storytelling is about agency.
Mm-hmm.